SEP Fanfic Readings presents 1,000 Words by Olive Juice 28. Chapter 16. Getting to Know You. One morning in early November, Draco entered the common room on his way back from the library. He was just planning to grab his potions book before meeting with one of his first years when he noticed Hermione sitting on the couch by the fire. She hadn't looked up when he came in, or made any indication that she had even heard the door open. As he slowed his pace, he observed her. Her back was mostly to him, but he could tell that her head was bent, like she was looking down at something. As he continued in the general direction of his room, he heard a very small sniff and saw the slightest shaking of her shoulders. She was crying. Without thinking, he walked directly over to her, stopping just slightly off to her right, in front of the couch. "Granger?" he started quietly. "Are you okay?" She gave a small nod, but still had not looked up from what he now saw was a piece of parchment that she was holding in her lap. As he stood there, contemplating what to do or say, because clearly she wasn't okay, he saw a single tear splash onto the page. Feeling slightly uncomfortable, since dealing with emotions was really not his strong suit, he sat down on the couch with a few inches of space between them and angled himself towards her, trying to see her face better. "Granger," he began again. "It's the last one," she whispered brokenly. "What is?" She passed the letter to him without looking, and he took it, glancing at the writing. He scanned the page, quickly realizing that this was one of the responses from the many experts she had written to, regarding her parents. This one, like so many others, expressed apology and sorrow for an inability to be of any help. And then he understood what she had meant. This was the last response that she had been waiting for. This was the one that she had been holding out hope for. His stomach felt like a lead weight had settled in on it, and he honestly didn't know what he could do or say that would be any good at this moment. "I'm sorry," he said after a brief pause, because he was, truly, that it had come to this for her. She nodded again, and another tear fell into her lap. Her curls were mostly pulled back in a loose bun, and he could see the tear tracks on her cheeks. Her eyes were closed, her lips tightly pressed in a thin line, and she seemed to be fighting very hard to hold herself together. Without knowing what possessed him to attempt this, he gently placed his left hand on her right shoulder. As soon as she felt the weight of it, she let out a small sob and buried her face in her hands, her elbows on her knees. Her shoulders were shaking harder, but she still wasn't making any sound apart from the quiet sniffles every so often. Still feeling rather out of his element, Draco conjured a handkerchief and held it out to her. "Here," he offered softly. Hermione lifted her face slightly, glanced at the proffered fabric, and then at Draco's face. Her eyes were red and filled with tears that continued to stream down her cheeks. She took the handkerchief, nodding for a third time, wiped her eyes and nose, and then clutched it between her hands as she looked unseeingly at them in her lap again. "Can I get you anything?" he offered, having no idea what he would get her if she said yes, but figured it was the best he could do. This time she shook her head and took in a deep breath, still not looking at him. She started to speak in a quavering voice. I kept telling myself not to give up." Her breath was catching in between the words. "That I still had more people to hear back from. But I don't. And—" She gave up trying to talk and once again leaned into her hands, her shoulders shaking even harder. "I really am sorry," whispered Draco. He scooted over, closing the small distance that had been between them, and as he did so, he moved his hand from her right shoulder across her back to rest on her left arm, giving her an awkward sidearm sort of hug. At this, she leaned into him and completely lost it. Her body racked with sobs, and he could feel the front of his shirt starting to soak through with her tears, and there was nothing he could do but sit there and let the storm rage. Draco couldn't recall a single moment in his life when he'd comforted another person. Not like this, anyway. His version of comforting was to tell Blaze to suck it up when his favorite shirt was dirty, or to punch Goyle on the shoulder and tell him not to worry about it when he'd failed another exam. For as foreign as the experience was to him, he didn't feel as uncomfortable as he'd expected. He wasn't sure if that was because this was Granger, and he had become fairly familiar with her recently, or because he was, as his mother liked to put it, becoming softer around the edges. All he knew was that here was someone deeply hurting, and she'd accepted the bumbling attempt he'd made to help, and he actually felt rather pleased about it. Who knew? A few more minutes went by, and Draco's arm was starting to go numb since he hadn't moved it even a centimeter, and Hermione's tears seemed to be slowing. When she shifted slightly, he gently eased his arm down and peered into her face. Her lashes were wet and her nose was slightly red, but she seemed much calmer. After wiping under her eyes again, she glanced at him and frowned. "I've ruined your shirt." She reached out to try to smooth the large wet patch beneath his left shoulder. His skin warmed where her hand rested, and he looked up to meet her still watery eyes. "It's fine," he chuckled. He took out his wand and waved it over the damp spot as a burst of warm air quickly dried it. She stared intently at him for a moment, then looked back down at her hands and the crumpled handkerchief they held. Feeling that this might be a good time to excuse himself, he lightly slapped his palms on his thighs and spoke. "Will you be all right?" She nodded, looked up at him again, giving him a small, tremulous smile. Draco heaved himself up off the couch, saying that he was off to meet with one of his first years as he strode into the chamber to grab a book. As he headed back towards the door of the room, he glanced at Hermione one more time. She was still sitting on the couch, but had looked up at him as he made his way across the space, watching him pensively. When he reached the door and was just about to step out, he heard her. "Thank you, Draco." He turned abruptly and saw that her small smile was a little sturdier now. He nodded and slipped out the door, but stopped in the hall as the realization dawned on him. She called him Draco. Daphne was one of the 8th years Hermione was thoroughly enjoying getting to know. She liked everyone in her new house, but Daphne was a gem. She was funny, outgoing, very bright, and extremely creative. Hermione, for all of her book knowledge and practicality, would not be described as the latter. The former Slytherin had a knack for knowing exactly how something would look before a line was even drawn on a page or the first step was taken in a project. She had made some small changes to various parts of her friends' chambers and to the room at large, which everyone agreed were improvements. One evening, Hermione was sitting in the pretty blonde's room, watching her charm ribbons into intricate designs before attaching them to a silk pillowcase. It was a gift Daphne was making for her sister, she'd explained, and offered to teach her new friend the technique. Unfortunately, after over an hour of attempts, Hermione's ribbons looked much more like trampled worms than anything else, and she was ready to give up, something she rarely did. Sensing the former Gryffindor's frustration, Daphne took out thicker ribbons, showed her an easier design, and decided to broach a topic she'd long been curious about. "So," she began in a light tone, "what's Harry Potter really like?" Hermione's wand stilled in mid-swirl, causing her ribbon, which actually looked vaguely similar to Daphne's for once, to drop to the rug with an unimpressive heap. Her eyes widened as she took in the look of genuine inquisitiveness on the other witch's face. "Harry?" "Yes, Harry. He's one of your best friends, right?" "Well, yes, obviously. But what—" Hermione trailed off, cocking her head to the side, trying to figure out what Daphne meant by this. "Well, I've always wondered what he's like as a person. You know, not the boy who lived, or the chosen one, or any of that. But what kind of human being is he? Does that make sense?" Hermione was still rather baffled, but she was starting to understand. "Have you never spoken to him?" Daphne snorted. "No. A Slytherin speak to Harry Potter? Aside from the guff Draco and his cronies used to give him constantly, how many of us did you ever see talk to him?" Hermione considered this, knowing full well that Daphne was right. She couldn't remember a single time that anyone else from the dungeons addressed Harry in all the years they were at school. Draco's taunts were an almost daily occurrence, with Crabbe and Goyle grunting alongside, and Pansy Parkinson might have joined in on occasion, but that was it. There were half a dozen other Slytherins in their year who'd never uttered a syllable in her best friend's direction. "I see your point," she conceded. "Well, Harry's just Harry." She smiled at the image of her messy-haired, green-eyed friend came to mind. "He's just a normal guy. He doesn't like all the attention he gets for being who he is. It wasn't his choice." "That's kind of what I thought," Daphne mused. "He doesn't seem big-headed about it or anything. The few times I was near him enough to overhear him talking to his friends, he seemed pretty down-to-earth considering everything." "Oh, he is," Hermione nodded vigorously. "He's funny and kind and very loyal, and he doesn't care what other people think about him, good or bad. He's had to put up with being in the public eye since he first came to Hogwarts, and it hasn't changed who he is." "That's impressive. I know lots of people who would let all the fame go to their head." Daphne gave her a smirk and rolled her eyes. Hermione laughed, able to think of several people herself. "What about Ron Weasley?" Daphne asked, watching the brunette witch's face closely. "You mean, what's he like?" "Yeah. He really was a regular bloke before he became friends with Harry, you know? So how has all that affected him?" Hermione thought about this for a moment. "Ron always felt like his big brothers overshadowed him, like he was an afterthought. Being friends with Harry sometimes made him think that even worse, but other times it allowed him to share the spotlight. He doesn't seem to mind the attention quite as much, she chuckled to herself. I think he likes when people stop him on the street and ask for a photo. Are the two of you together? Hermione's eyes went wide, surprised by the question. No, she replied immediately. No, we're just friends. For a while, I think both of us might have wanted something more, but not anymore. She noticed the melancholy feeling that used to accompany this train of thought was no longer present, and it made her smile. He's seeing Katie Bell now, I think. Really? Daphne's eyebrows shot up. Hermione nodded, then decided she would ask a few questions of her own. Who were you closest to in your year? Theo, Daphne said without hesitation. Seeing her new friend's curious look, she continued. We grew up together. Our mothers were cousins, so we spent a great deal of time together at each other's houses. His mom died when he was 8, and he spent a lot more time at my house after that. A scowl crossed her pretty features as she went on. Theo's father was never very invested in him, to put it nicely. Even less so once his wife was gone. Thought his son was a waste of his time. Nothing Theo ever did was right, or good enough for him. That's awful, murmured Hermione. You have no idea. But I'll give you one example. Daphne sat up straighter and started fiddling with one of the ribbons, rubbing it between her fingers. Theo would come to my house, and he, Astoria, and I would play for hours, mostly hide and seek, until the house elves got tired of finding us where they were trying to work. She smiled fondly at the memory. Usually he would stay for dinner, and if he did, afterwards he would play chess with my father. She gave a small, humorous huff. Neither Tori or I were very good at the game, but Theo was, so my father would play with him in his study. The night before we were to come to Hogwarts for the very first time, my father gifted Theo with a chess set of his own, told him to bring it to school and invite his new housemates to play. I'd never seen Theo so excited. Her eyes took on a fierce but mournful look, and she shook her head. Apparently, when he got home, his father saw the chess set and asked him where he got it. Theo told him, and his father went into a rage, screaming at him for wasting his time playing games, telling him that's not what he was going to school for. He took the chess set and threw it into the fireplace and forced Theo to sit there and watch the broken pieces burn. Hermione's eyes prickled with tears. She couldn't imagine a parent treating their child that way. That's horrible, she breathed in a pained whisper. Daphne nodded. For the first 3 years here, Theo barely spoke to anyone, even me. He'd sit with me for meals and in classes, but we didn't joke around anymore. When he did talk, he was distant and cold, like he was a completely different person. What changed? Hermione asked, trying to reconcile the Theo being described with the snarky, teasing boy she'd grown to consider a friend. Were you at the Quidditch World Cup the summer before 4th year? Daphne asked. Yes, said Hermione, recalling the frightening events that overshadowed the once-in-a-lifetime experience. So were we. Theo and I went together, and he found out afterwards that his father was one of the Death Eaters responsible for harming that Muggle family. She watched Hermione, gauging her reaction to this bit of information. To her relief, her new housemate simply nodded in understanding, so she continued. He showed up at my house one night, about a week after the match, and told me what he'd learned. He was frantic and terrified that he was going to be associated with all of it because of his name. He begged me to let him stay with my family until school started. Of course I did. Didn't his father wonder where he was? Hermione asked. Not likely, Daphne snorted. He was probably relieved he didn't have to deal with the inconvenience of being a parent. She shrugged and started charming ribbons again, weaving multiple strands together in a delicate pattern. We talked a lot during the days that followed, and by the time we got back to school, he was much more like himself, and much more like my childhood friend. Last year was rough with the Carrows running things, and the battle and everything, but he's really happy this year. I think a big part of that has to do with the fact that his father is safely locked away in Azkaban, she smirked. I had heard Nott Sr. was sentenced to life, same as Lucius Malfoy, Hermione responded, her mind wandering to the younger Malfoy. Yep, both Theo and Draco really won the draw with fathers they have. She rolled her eyes, but then pinned her companion with a questioning gaze. Speaking of, you and Draco seem to be getting along rather well this term, considering your history. She noticed a slight blush color Hermione's cheeks and had to stop herself from grinning smugly. Yes, we get along fine, Hermione mumbled, not willing to meet the azure eyes she could feel boring into her. You know, he used to talk about you all the time, Daphne offered, wondering how this would be received. Hermione grunted. I'm sure. He made his opinions about me very well known for the first 6 years we shared the castle. Well, yes, Daphne agreed lightly. but one doesn't typically fixate on someone to that degree unless there's more to it. Brown eyes flew up to meet blue and narrowed in skepticism. What do you mean? Just that while, yes, Draco did say lots of unflattering things about you, he also watched you. In class, in the Great Hall, in the corridors, in the Quidditch stands on the train. He couldn't pass you by without commenting or staring. I think the staring was more telling than anything else, really. She smiled at the look of shock on Hermione's face. Staring? Daphne giggled. Yes, quite a bit of staring. Obsessive levels of it, if I'm being honest. You don't notice that a person's walk is too bouncy or their eyes are too round if you're not paying very close attention. Hermione had no idea what to make of this information. She was completely willing to accept that Malfoy had changed, and was very happy to call him her friend. She might even, in the most secret corners of her heart, harbor slightly deeper feelings for him. But to hear that he had been watching her all these years was a revelation she couldn't reconcile. Seeing her confusion, Daphne continued, You know he had a fit at the Yule Ball, right? Hermione just cocked an eyebrow in question. Daphne chortled gleefully and clapped her hands together, clearly enjoying her role as storyteller. Oh, yes, an absolute fit. He had been bragging about how he was going to find the best-looking girl at the ball and ask her to dance. I'm sure you saw him standing at the side of the dance floor with his thugs and Pansy, who, by the way, was seriously ticked that he didn't ask her to be his date. Hermione couldn't stop the snort that escaped. Exactly, nodded Daphne. Anyway, Theo and I were near them as the champions entered. Immediately, Draco said something about Crumb's date and how she was the one he was going to ask, as soon as the opening song was over. But about halfway through, you two had come close enough for all of us to get a better look at you, and we figured it out. We? Technically, Blaise figured out it was you, or at least he was the first to say it. He never could keep anything to himself, and he just blurted out, You know that's Granger, right? And it was like everyone froze. Daphne chuckled at the memory and huffed a sigh. But then, we had all endured 4 years of Draco's rants about you. You were like the Voldemort of our year. No one ever said your name around him. So when Blaise said that, she gave a low whistle. We knew it wasn't going to be pretty. Hermione was loath to admit how intrigued she was by this whole account. She could picture the night so clearly, and even remembered twirling across the dance floor until she saw she was an arm's length from Malfoy. She also remembered the blazing look in his eyes and the stony set to his jaw. It was a common expression for him, so she hadn't thought anything of it, assuming he was just glaring at her as usual. Everyone kind of stepped away a little, giving Draco a tiny bit of space, except for Pansy. Blaise's announcement seemed to make her think Draco would need her support or comfort or whatever idiotic notion crossed her mind. So she actually latched onto his arm and tried to pull him closer. Daphne rolled her eyes and shook her head. He stood there, frozen like a statue for the rest of the song. He was clenching his jaw so tight I thought his teeth would shatter. He'd gone really pale, which is saying something, but his eyes never left you. Not once. Before she could stop herself, Hermione asked, What happened when the song ended? Well, first he ripped his arm out of Pansy's clutches, glared at her, then at all of the rest of us. Then he stormed out of the Great Hall without saying a word. Of course, Pansy was the only one dumb enough to chase after him. She followed him down to our common room, where they got in a huge screaming row. She accused him of fancying you, which of course he would never have admitted to back then, and he blew up a couch. He blew up a couch? Hermione was stunned. Daphne nodded, a grin tugging on her cheeks, with mirth swimming in them. When we all found them, there were still bits of stuffing floating around the room. It looked like it was snowing. She studied her new friend for a moment before deciding to share a more recent observation. You know, Draco's a lot happier this year. He's more relaxed, for one thing. He truly seems to enjoy being back. I think part of that has to do with the fact that he no longer has his father, or a noseless psychopath looming over him. But mostly, I think it has to do with you. Me? Yes. For all those years, he had to hate you. I know it seems stupid, but it's the way it was. Now he can be friends with whoever he wants. She shrugged and smiled encouragingly at Hermione. He can be whoever he wants. We all can. Hermione pondered her housemate's words as they resumed charming the ribbons and chatted about the upcoming holiday season and the end-of-term exams. She knew Daphne was right. With the war over and the lines that had been previously drawn erased, it was an opportunity for many to start over. It was a chance to forge new paths and pursue new interests, herself included. and she smiled to herself as she considered the gentle concern the pale wizard had shown for her a few days before. Pursuing new interests, indeed.